Welcome to HumanFuel, a podcast that explores the human art of thriving. Join two psychologists as they unpack the themes of well-being, effectiveness, and transformation for a more productive, fuller, and happier life.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the second episode of the HumanFuel podcast. In this episode, we will explore multiple identities that we hold in our lives and multiple roles that we hold and how we navigate them at different times in our lives. We will share some personal stories and some tips for you to try out if you would like to. I'm your host today. My name is Spencer. I'm a psychologist and integral coach, and I'm here with my co-host, Joy.
Hello, I'm Joy, psychologist, multidimensional healer, and the Doctor of Joy, co-hosting with Spencer today.
All right, so I'm going to jump in. I want to share a personal story to start off this podcast. It was COVID time, hard lockdown, 2019. What a strange time.
Yeah.
I remember things like pineapple beer and the smell of sanitizer. And not being able to see people's faces because everyone was wearing masks. We were living on the third floor of a small block of flats in Glenwood at the time. Stairs, no lift, so I was a lot fitter than I am now. And one night, probably somewhere around 10 p.m., my wife turned to me and said that she was not able to breathe, or she was struggling to breathe. She has asthma, and we didn't know how COVID would interact with asthma, so we were obviously very nervous. We hopped in the car. Fortunately, the hospital is just up the road. So we rode up to Intabeni Hospital. I remember quite clearly the tents outside at the time when they were screening people for COVID. And I remember the queues of people that were waiting in line to get screened. So they told her they needed to run a few tests. And one of them, they needed to know if she was pregnant. She didn't think so, but she couldn't rule it out. So she said she did not know. So I think they took bloods, and they said that they would call her in a few hours with the results, which they did. And so in the early hours of the morning, probably around 2, they said, please come to the hospital. So we hopped. Well, first we walked down our 3 flights of stairs, hopped in the car and drove off to the hospital. And then she went inside, and I remember her being inside for quite a long time to eventually return with a message and a note, which she handed me. So she said, the good news is I don't have COVID. And then she handed me this note to read, which I was very grumpy because it was so early in the morning. And now I'm being told to read this thing in the dark, which I couldn't read. So I eventually just said to her, please just tell me what this says. And she says, it says that I'm pregnant. So I woke up very quickly, and fast forward a few months into 2020, and my first child is born.
Oof.
And now I have a new identity or a new role. I am a father, and it doesn't matter what else I was up until that point or going forward. I was now a father. And so I started to realize that the way that we see ourselves is very one-dimensional. We tend to choose a lens, whether that be some sort of professional, an athlete, or a spouse, and we become fixated with thinking about ourselves as that thing. And then something comes along to disrupt the pattern for us and throws our world into turmoil. Let's say your entire identity is wrapped up in your profession. You're a mechanic, or you're a chartered accountant, or something else. And you become chronically ill or otherwise incapacitated. And you can no longer do that job. And that is a big blow. Where does that leave you? So, Joy, what comes up for you when I tell you that?
I think about my own life where, I became so ill, severely depressed actually in recent years, that I couldn't really work anymore. And that really disturbed my identity. I kind of didn't know what I was doing, who I was, because without me even knowing, I prided myself of being this purpose-led individual. But without me knowing, this was actually very career encapsulated and had a lot to do with how I was building this business and showing up as like a healer in the different business spaces that I was invited to. And when I was not doing that, I literally did not know who I was. And I had to start almost like from scratch in terms of zooming out and figuring all the other things that I was doing. And I mean, we spoke in the previous episode on how purpose sort of needs to infiltrate all areas of your life and not just the career. And I kind of like was stuck on being this business healer. And I realized that I can hold space for healing in general. A lot for myself, a lot for my own family that I was going through grief. And that helped me to really look at the various areas in which my purpose can find meaning outside of this specific role of being this business leader or business healer. So I really know just like the lived experience of what that's like to just kind of almost feel like a rug has been pulled under your feet and going, okay, who am I now?
Yeah, you suddenly have to think about it if you haven't thought about it before.
Yeah, but definitely gives a lot of perspective and insights, personal insights in how we are living our lives. And when you think about the topic of today of multiple identities, I actually think about this quote on Money Heist. What was her character? Tokyo was asked what she does or something along those lines. But I remember the statement that she came up with, and she's like, "We are multitudes." And I'll never forget that statement because I think it really reflected the many different things that we can be.
Yeah.
Outside of what we, society deems us to be. Although having a working identity is kind of important in society in a way. So sometimes there is that influence externally that does maybe push us to adopting certain identities more than others.
Yeah, certainly in our society, I wonder if, I'm sure there are societies in the world where work doesn't play such a central role in defining who you are. And maybe in some respects that's healthier. I don't know.
Yeah, a lot of nature-based indigenous communities, actually, back in the day, it wasn't about where you get paid and that defined who you are, actually, as an identity. It was much more balanced in terms of the multiple roles people played in society.
Yeah, it's interesting. All right, so I've got 3 main ideas for the listeners. So we'll jump into the first one. And the first one is that each of us has multiple roles. I've kind of been using identity and roles interchangeably. So we've got multiple roles that we play or identities that we fulfill. One of them is our identity we've spoken about as a worker, but we are also friends to others. We are siblings, we are children, we are partners, and sometimes we leaders in our communities or things like that. And most of us, at least, hopefully the majority of us, have hobbies or things that we do for fun. And some of us are defined, or at least it forms part of our identities, the hobbies that we take part in.
Yeah.
So for me, I play music as a hobby. I'm a hobby musician. And so I call myself a musician. It's part of my identity. And some of these roles naturally come to the fore at certain periods of our lives and are more in the background at other times. So certainly if you, for example, are a student, you've got a lot more time and you might be using the time to invest yourself more in your hobbies, for example. If I look at my stage of life, my time has had to shift because I have young children, and naturally young children require more time, energy and attention than older children, and that time with your children is going to crowd out some of the other things that you did before because time is a finite resource. And if we don't consciously think about these things, we default to the way that our parents were or the way that society expects us to be, and sometimes we get mixed up. So a good example of this is the role of a parent. I say this carefully, in most cases. No one could ever love a child as much as the child's mother or father. So you're not all that replaceable as a parent. But then as professionals, we think we are not replaceable, but in reality, we are often highly replaceable. Now, we might not consciously verbalize or consider this, but if we were to, we'd probably see that the way that we're acting indicates that we have got things mixed up. We act as if we are irreplaceable at work, but replaceable at home, when in reality, the opposite is true. So, Joy, what do you think about that?
Well, first, that's a powerful point. And it's so true, the whole just reversal nature of it. And I think that sometimes we get so sucked into what society wants us to be because we're also comparing and competing with other people, particularly in our work identities. But even in parenting, I've seen that it becomes less about your journey with it and deepening your approach to it, but more about how can I better the other person and be a better dad than the other guy, or how can I get promoted quicker than someone else. And I think what's kind of made me pause on that was how you mentioned the importance of maybe even zooming out and then looking at the different life stage that you're in. When you look at maybe being unsatisfied in a particular area or role that you're playing, and how that's always in the context of your life and your life stage, which might be completely different for someone else, where you might be in a stage of being a dad and the first 3 years of your kids, and how crucial those are for just close contact parenting. I'm not at that stage. We might be of similar ages, but I'm not at a parenting stage yet. So I have all of the time, and have had all of the time, to just throw into my career or throw it in other things that might make me feel, or that might look like I'm doing better in comparison. But it's all about just the amount of energy I have and the space and the life stage that I'm in. So it makes me really think about how we can even compare or compete with each other on some of these things, because then if we take our whole life into account, it kind of doesn't make a lot of sense sometimes to then compete and have these comparisons with others on the different roles.
Yeah, it makes zero sense. And in fact, most of the time, our life stages don't align, because apart from those early years of life, maybe up to the end of high school, where your peers are pretty much mostly in the same situation as you, going through the same milestones at the same time, that rule just doesn't apply after university or even after school. The chances are the person, as you mentioned, if you're competing with someone, the chances are they just are in a different phase of life, and also might have different priorities. So there's certainly wisdom in becoming aware of what your priorities are, but we'll talk to that in a moment. So, I've got 3 kind of ideas here that could hopefully help to add meaning to your life and hopefully become a little happier. And the first one is approach your life with an investor mindset. So don't invest all your attention in one thing, but hedge your bets with a few things, like a well-balanced investment portfolio. You can shift your time around, taking a bit from here and adding a bit there. But try to keep those roles that are core to your identity. So if you are, for example, a runner, you can scale your running up and down depending on the other roles that you need to play. But try not to drop it altogether. It's part of who you are. So at least some of your time, prioritize activities based purely on how much fun they are to you. And then you'll see what you gravitate towards. Obviously, we all have different ideas of what's fun. But joy, So in my life, I mentioned that I play music, and that's core to who I am. And I've tried not to forget that. And so even though my priority might be my children at this stage of life, I will try and find little pockets of time, whether that be a few minutes here and there, a few times a week, to sit down and play the guitar or play my bass, because that's something that is one of my identities, or at least part of my identity. So that's something I do. Do you have, is there things that you do?
Yeah, like a few things opened up when I went for just self-employment and could free my time. I was able to spend a lot more time with some of my childhood hobbies, like tennis. That was a big part of it. And now that I also have shifted my life to also live by the ocean, I do a lot of just ocean walks, beach meditations, that sort of thing, creating room for that. And I'm even now also trying to explore ways to give back to society, and not in like the traditional way, but in also ways that you mentioned that are fun. For example, I used to really enjoy and be really good at netball. And I am in the process just trying to find a school, a group of, girls that need a coach because it's something that I really want to just go back to and make time for quite intentionally. And it's something that can also just use my coaching element in, leadership element in as well, while keeping fit and healthy and doing something that I enjoy. So been exploring with some of those ideas. But whenever you talk about that, the question that I do have is around time. People are always like, well, there's no time for the stuff, or we always are crying for more time. So how do we navigate that practically?
So I mean, I've got some ideas here, but the one thing that's coming up as you ask the question is, I heard someone say it once. I think Jordan Harbinger actually said this on his podcast, but he said that you have to shift your language as well. So it's not that you don't have time, but you deprioritizing or prioritizing something. And I think that's key, because don't have time is very disempowering. It's a very disempowering thing to say. You're never going to have time if you say you don't have time. And life is demanding, and your roles are demanding. But it helps to consciously acknowledge that for a period of time you have deprioritized something, or that you have prioritized something. So I try and use that as intentionally in my own life. When people ask me why I am or am not doing something, I try to say, well, I've deprioritized that now. And it's not about productivity or about efficiency. It's about reminding myself that I'm making a conscious choice about what is important to me at that point in time.
I like that a lot.
But and I think it leads kind of quite nicely into my point number 2, which is to recognize that you already play multiple roles. So whether you are aware of this or not, make them more conscious by writing them down, so journaling about them. And we spoke about journaling in the last episode. Don't overthink it. You can cross things out, you can add, you can change. Just make a start. It's about bringing stuff that's not conscious into your conscious awareness, and recognize which of them bring you the greatest joy or fulfillment. So recognize when you've written down all of the roles that you play, just keep writing until you've got nothing more to write, the different roles that you play, and then recognize which of them bring me fulfillment or joy. Then you can start making decisions. So what do I want to do more of? What do I want to do less of? What do I want to cut out altogether? And here's a big one. We've touched on this already, but coming back to it, consider what is important to focus on right now, or for the next period of time, however you define that. So whether you say a month or a year or 5 years, whatever that period of time is, consider what is important to you now and flex your schedule around that. So Joy, you mentioned those first 3 years. Gabor Mate talks about this, how important the first 3 years of a child's life are. In his words, or something along the lines of, the good news is that if you get the first 3 years right, then the rest of your child's life is going to be a whole lot better. And so that is something I'm aware of with my kids, is that they're not always going to be young children, but they're going to grow up and become teenagers and not care very much about me. But for a period of time, my presence is more important than ever, and that's that period when they are very young, 1 to 3 or 1 to 4 years old. And so it makes sense then, in acknowledging and making it conscious, that I push some things to the back for a while and that I move some important activities to the front. But I can only do that when I'm aware of it. So that's the idea there.
So writing it down really brings about a lot of awareness as well, that of other roles that maybe we might have not acknowledged as much as we can.
I think so. It's like, it's just popping to my head now. I don't know if we, in primary school, I think it was, we did an exercise at some point where they gave us an object and they said, write down as many uses for this object. Do you remember that?
Yes.
I mean, it's just popped into my head now, but it's so true that, I mean, you might think that there's one use for an object, but you write and you end up with 20. But you would never have got to 20 if you hadn't written it down. It's like our brains just don't work like that. We have to put stuff out of, on paper so that we can think of the next thing. We can move on to the next thing. And so I think it's the same kind of concept here. There's a whole lot of things or roles that you play that you are not even aware of. And the only reason you're not aware of is because you haven't sat down and thought about it.
But when you look at your life, Spencer, which are some of the roles that you enjoy the most?
Yeah,
right now.
Yeah, so parenting is hard work, but I do enjoy it. But I think it's my hobby stuff that I really enjoy. I've mentioned music a few times, and I run as well. I don't do much of that at the moment, but like we spoke about scaling, it's just something that I've scaled back for a time. But then also another aspect to this is not just, so enjoyment is certainly one way to kind of filter on, but another way is also what's just important to you. And so one of the maybe less fun things is that I'm what they call a street captain in my community, which basically just means I'm one of a small group of people that liaises with the community policing forum and our road. Now, I don't love that, but it is a role that I play that is important. And so
Which one?
Street captain. So
Okay.
basically the liaison. So we work with the community policing forum and the local community, and we're just a link between the two. But yeah, those are...
But you also play the role in Psyopsa.
I did.
Well,
I'm no longer
no
doing
way.
that. Yeah, but for a few years I was the regional chair for SAP. So yeah, so that's another role.
Yeah. Which you can really just undermine and rule out, but it's a role in a particular community.
It's true. Yeah. And I didn't think of it, and you just brought it up. So there we go. You have to, you have to kind of articulate these things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When I think about roles that are probably very important to me right now, is to, as a founder, that role is quite big. To be pioneering in my approach, and that means just really exploring and going deeper into the things that I'm doing, making sure that my differentiator comes from an authentic place than just looking at what other people are doing, and giving myself the room and the courage. That's another element I think that we haven't touched on enough. That some of our roles, especially when we start off them, when we get them kick-started, is need a lot of courage to get us started
Absolutely.
with. Imagine being thrown into being a dad, and how much courage you needed to kind of thrust yourself into that role, and it's now a lifetime role.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And not even that short term.
Yeah.
And even just this whole role that I thrusted myself in, being a founder, it wasn't something that I sat too long with, but something I thought was the right time to explore. Also considering that I didn't have kids,
Yes.
or anybody really dependent on me, so I could take that risk. But that role is the most important to me right now. Founder, and linked to that, healer. So
Nice.
I'm really exploring different modalities when it comes to healing. Sound also being part of it. So I spend a lot of time also on the piano, experimenting with different harmonies and melodies, training my voice, reading a lot of books on sound healing. But I must say, that took a lot of courage to step into. It almost reminds me of the example you gave. Was it in the previous episode or this one, of the guy who moved from banker to...
Yeah, the last episode. Yeah.
Yeah, and how we can be so conditioned in particular ways and
Absolutely.
forming our identity around these ways, and then there's this other part that keeps calling you deeply and is also keeps doing that consistently, and you can't do anything else but just sort of pursue it in some way or form. It takes a lot of courage to kind of step into some of these roles that are different to what we usually mold ourselves to be. And I think that's also an element that I wanted to add to the conversation as well. How do we then just sort of break away from this normal identity, particularly around this is my professional identity and this is who I am in society, and then have the courage to actually just explore other things too, because sometimes we don't even know where to start.
Absolutely. And especially if you have a performance mindset about things that you want to be good. That's where, I mean, I'm guessing that's where the courage really comes in. You have to be courageous then, because it feels like you've got that fear of failing. One of my favorite quotes, I don't know who said it, anything worth doing is worth doing badly. And it's not an endorsement of doing things badly. So people look at me funny when I say this. I'm not saying you should do things badly. I'm just saying if something is worth doing, then even doing it badly is worthwhile, because it's worth doing it.
Yeah, that makes me think of, there was a quote also around dancing, where it's like sometimes you just dance because you want to dance, not because you want to be good at dancing per se, but it's an expression, a way of being. And I do want us to actually kind of double click on the point you made around this performance culture, because I do think that also comes with the primary identity being around being a worker. Has almost embedded this performance thing around everything then we do.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Needs to have like
this performance measure for its being worthwhile, for example.
Yeah, it makes me wonder how much of the language and the culture around work has informed the way that we think about ourselves as human beings.
In other parts of our
life. That's fundamentally flawed, because life is not entirely about performance. It's a very small aspect of it in many respects.
Yeah, or just about productivity, right?
Yeah.
Because, for example, I can spend a lot of hours and hours on the piano, not being that great, but fully just absorbed in it though.
Absolutely.
And that can start triggering other ideas related to music and sound, even when I leave the piano.
Absolutely.
So it's not only about this progress that has
not
happening
about progress
within
at all.
this, but it's immersing yourself into a thing and kind of figuring out your role in how you engage with this thing.
And it's personally enriching, right? So if nothing else, you come away from the piano feeling enriched.
And just good. I must be honest. That's why I don't want us to lose the part of also looking at what's fun for us to do.
Yeah.
While what's important for us to do is obviously the more logical starting point, I think that we shouldn't lose sight on what we also just enjoy doing, so that we do have some sort of hobbies outside of work too.
Absolutely.
In a way.
And it actually leads perfectly into point number 3, or my tip number 3 is to play around with the frivolous or whimsical things.
Love it. Love it.
So I'm not saying waste your time, but I am saying waste your time.
Yeah.
I'm not saying spend hours and hours on TikTok. But for goodness sake, read a novel, go for a walk on the beach, do one of a million other non-productivity or anti-productivity things to remind yourself that you are human and you're more than just a factor of production.
Ooh.
There's something deeply human about taking moments and sometimes big chunks of time to do things that might seem on the outside to be pointless. Most often we don't do this because we're fixated on a particular role at a given point of time. Or, like we've been saying, perhaps we're fixated on the performance of something and how to make a thing a performance.
This podcast also aims to improve cultural inclusion of psychology through language. The word for this episode is adaptability, which is described by the American Psychological Association as the capacity to make appropriate responses to changed or changing situations, the ability to modify or adjust one's behavior in meeting different circumstances or different people. NgesiZulu ke singahumusha sithi ukuvumelana nezimo. Ukuvumelana nezimo osuke ubhekane nazo. Adaptability.
All right, so a recap on today's podcast, or some points to take away. And what we'll do is we'll put a worksheet up for you to work through some of these things, to journal about, or just to use however you like. So 3 points: diversify your life portfolio. So choose where you want to spend your energy and attention and when. Number 2, become conscious of your roles and identities so that you can play around with them and live more intentionally. And number 3, do anti-productivity stuff just because it's fun and incredibly important to your well-being. Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to HumanFuel podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode and got some value out of it. If you did, the best compliment that you can give us is to share the episode with a friend. You can also leave us a comment on YouTube or send us an email at humanfuelza@gmail.com. Your feedback helps us to create better content, so we would love to hear from you. Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you in the next episode.